Welcome! Today, we're going to dive into a really powerful shift in how we think about lesson planning. It's all about moving away from those rigid objectives and instead creating richer, more dynamic learning environments. Let's get right into it. So, let's start with a big question, one that I'm sure every teacher has wrestled with. You spend all this time crafting the perfect lesson, right? You've got your teaching points all lined up, but does that plan really control what sticks in your students' minds at the end of the day? And that question leads us straight to a core tension in teaching, something we can call the planning paradox. It's a feeling a lot of us know all too well.
I mean, we've all been there. You teach a grammar point with what you think is perfect clarity, you go through all the exercises, and then the next day, it's like it never even happened. The hard truth is, what we teach isn't always what gets learned. And sometimes what students do learn isn't what we intended at all.
You know, the researcher Dick Allwright just captured this feeling perfectly. He points out this fundamental gap between our nice, neat list of teaching points and the messy, unpredictable, and wonderful reality of what learners actually take away from it all. So, if planning for these specific, isolated teaching points isn't the whole answer, what's the alternative? Well, this is where we have to shift our thinking, away from trying to control outcomes and towards creating possibilities. And here's the key idea. We need to move from planning for teaching points to planning for learning opportunities. Think about it. These are those moments, often totally unexpected, that just pop up from a student's question or an interaction or sudden need to express something. That's where the magic, the real learning, actually happens. A great way to think about this is to picture your lesson's aim as a spotlight. A narrow aim, like teach the present perfect, is a super tight beam. Yeah, it might hit the target for a few students, but a lot of others are going to be left in the dark. But a broader aim, like let's talk about our work experiences, well, that casts a much wider spotlight. It lights up a much bigger area, making space for more students to get involved and for all kinds of unexpected learning to pop up.
Okay, so that all sounds great in theory, right? But what does creating these opportunities actually look like in a real live classroom? How do we make it happen?
Really, the main strategy is to intentionally build space into your lesson. Space for learners to bring their own ideas, their own content to the table. Because when students feel a sense of ownership, their engagement and their willingness to learn just goes through the roof. And look, this doesn't have to be some big, complicated overhaul. It can be as simple as asking, hey, what'd you think about that text? Or prompting them to connect new language to their own lives. Even just giving them some choice in the topic or the activity can make a huge difference. And this gets to a really critical idea. Your plan needs flexibility. It needs what we can call slack. Think about it. If your lesson is packed so tightly, planned from minute to minute, there's just no room for anything unexpected to happen. There's no room for that emergent language to appear.
You can probably see how this approach changes the role of the teacher in a subtle but really important way. It becomes less about being a presenter of information and much more about being a facilitator of learning.
I absolutely love this quote from Kumarva because it captures this dual role so well. On one hand, we are the architects. We design the conditions for learning. But on the other hand, we're also the improvisers who can skillfully work with the opportunities that the learners themselves create right there in the moment.
Okay, let's really see how this plays out. We're going to compare two very different approaches to a lesson, and I think this will bring the contrast into sharp focus. Just look at the difference here. In that tightly controlled lesson, the teacher presents, the learner just sort of receives, and the learning follows this very narrow, predetermined path. But in the opportunity-driven lesson, everything changes. The teacher facilitates, the learner is an active contributor, and the learning itself just emerges organically from that interaction. So this is the fundamental shift in mindset. It's about moving away from trying to control the teaching, and instead focusing all our energy on creating the conditions for learning. One is about delivery. The other is about cultivation.
So, with all of this in mind, how can we start applying this to our own teaching? What are the key things we need to remember when we sit down to plan?
Let's just quickly recap the big ideas. First, always remember that gap between teaching and learning. Second, prioritize those broad communicative goals. Third, build in that essential slack time. Fourth, embrace that dual role of being both a planner and a responsive facilitator. And finally, see your main job as creating a fertile ground where learning can really grow.
And so, that leaves us with one last question to think about. As you get ready for your next class, try not to just ask, what am I going to teach? Instead,
Ask yourself this: how will I plan for opportunity, not just for a specific outcome? Thanks so much for joining me.